Welcome everyone to the January 2022 first meeting of the Partner Inflicted Brain Injury Task Force.
As we've talked on this program, that Eve and I have co-edited a special issue on traumatic brain injury and intimate partner violence for the Journal of Pet Trauma Rehabilitation. That was 11 papers and one letter, the editor from Katherine, and talked about the task force. So that was great. And so one of the papers that was highlighted in terms of the special issue was one led by Lynn Hogg, and Danielle was second author on that, Danielle Toccalino and myself, and Maria Jennifer Estrella, who I think is on the line as well today. And with the title of it was The Shadow Pandemic, a Qualitative Exploration of the Impacts of COVID-19 on Service Providers and Women Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence and Brain Injury. So this, one of the issues in terms of a press release on the whole special issue, the journal or the publishing house, we wanted the whole thing to be all the papers highlighted in the press release, but their practice is to focus on one, and they picked this one. And I think it's the link to COVID was compelling. And so with that, the press release went out and was picked up by CTV and national television. And this one reporter has actually covered her work in the past, Eva Favreau, interviewed Lynn, as well as Necca McGregor, who's been on this program, who runs Women at the Center, which is the only, I think, nonprofit that is run by women affected by violence for women affected by violence. And also included Lynn Turkstra, who had also a paper in the special issue looking at prevalence of IPV TBI in a concussion clinic in Ontario, Canada. She just had a really brief flash in there. And so anyway, we didn't know exactly when it was going to air, and I just turned on the TV myself Sunday night, and there it was. So then we got the link out and we shared it. So anyway, we invite you to take a look. It is, there's a graphic piece to it, but we were pleased to have that covered in the national media. So I do want to say also today that, like a very last minute, Danielle Toccalino, who also is who led a paper in the special issue based on a national summit in Canada, agreed to speak at very short notice. I think it was less than 24 hours today. So I'm also looking forward to her talk. I don't know if you want to say anything more about the special issue. I'm looking at the time, and
I think we're going to have more information on the special issue in the next. I think are we skipping next month because of breaks, Katherine?
We're still up in the air about that, because
okay,
we'll see if somebody sees, but we're gonna focus on the next 2 or 3 meetings on this issue and the resources, and share presentations from people that want to share. Did you want to say anything, Eve, about the issue before we go to the presentation?
So I mean, the only thing I'll say is I think it's great. Angela and I actually had so many people who submitted abstracts that we had to actually turn some away because we just couldn't, one issue couldn't accommodate that many articles. And so we chose based on various factors. But the bottom line is that was really awesome, because it meant there were this many people who had something to say about IPP related TBI, which 3 or 4 years ago would not have been I don't think would have been a case. There was one other issue in Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma that came out that did something like this, but I think more of those articles may have been reviews. I forget. I know mine was kind of a review, but the bottom line was it's that there is a growing appreciation for this topic, and some people are recognizing it more so than has been the case in the past. And so we have, I mean, I know there's the epidemiology paper on strangulation, and then I submitted a paper on the effects of strangulation independent of other TBIs. And there were also, there's a pilot study, neuroimaging study, and then, neurobehavioral effects. There's a lot of different things that were, in addition to what Angela was just talking about. So there's very practical pieces and more researchy pieces. And so I think it's a really nice issue. And hopefully people will get a chance to see it.
Yeah, I do want to add in terms of practical issues that we have the care, connected, acknowledge, respond, and evaluate from the Center for Partner Inflicted Brain Injury. There's a link to the website as well for those resources. And it's true. In fact, the editor, said that he was impressed with the response. It was way more than other special issues in terms of the numbers of submissions. And it was hard, we had to do it with his input in terms of which ones were turned away. It was very hard to do that. But I guess we just encourage people to keep submitting. We weren't able to ask for two sessions in a row, like two special issues in a row. But anyway.
And then the last piece I just want to add, I think as there is COVID money coming out for research, for practice, for lots of different places out of some of the new kind of government funding, being able to tie brain injury into that with the COVID article that is in there, that was actually something that I think that is very, very timely. So being able to use COVID funding, which kind of establishing that link and that connection is so important, is really, really going to help us in Ohio, Angela and Eve. So thank you for putting that in there. We sent it to our administrators of all this money coming into the state for DV programs. Like brain injury needs to be a piece of the healthcare response.
Danielle's work is based on a national summit that we held with emergency funding related to COVID and IPV. And with it's just one of 3 papers, actually. She has a paper that was also published in the Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. And so it has very practical kind of recommendations from a very diverse. Anyway, I don't want to say any more because I want to really introduce Danielle, who's prepared to give a talk today. So if I may, I would like to introduce Danielle Toccalino, who is a member of the Acquired Brain Injury Research Lab at the University of Toronto, and I have the honor of being her doctoral supervisor. And so she's a doctoral candidate in health services research at the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. And her dissertation research is exploring the intersections of intimate partner violence, traumatic brain injury, and mental health, substance abuse, specifically as it relates to access and use of healthcare and community services. She holds a master's in neuroscience from McGill University, investigating learning and memory using songbirds as a model system, and an undergraduate degree in cognitive neuroscience with a joint focus on linguistics and neuroscience from McGill University as well. So she is a member of our Acquired Brain Injury Research Lab at the University of Toronto and has collaborated on several multi-site research projects involving diverse teams, community partners, persons with lived experience, and including planning, stakeholder, and advisory meetings. And outside of the lab, Danielle is the vice president of her student organization, involved in many initiatives, and she's the founding member and current president of the Emerging Leaders for Environmental Sustainability in Healthcare, and which is an interdisciplinary group bringing together students from across the University of Toronto who are passionate about environmental sustainability and healthcare to raise awareness and drive change. So without further ado, Danielle, love to listen to what you've put together.
Wonderful, thank you. So hopefully you can all see my screen and you're seeing my slides and not my presenter view. I can get a
Great transition there.
brilliant. I love it when that works. It doesn't always. So thank you, Angela, for that lovely introduction. And you know who I am, so I'm just going to jump right into it. Before I do, I really want to take a moment to create some space around acknowledging the land that we're situated on. So I'm calling in from Toronto here, and that it has been for thousands of years the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit River. And today this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, including Inuit and the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. It's also host to Indigenous peoples from many other countries as well. And it's important for us to recognize, particularly in spaces that are talking about healthcare and talking about health, the impact of colonization as the primary reason for many of the social and economic challenges facing Indigenous people in Canada and globally. And I believe it's critical to support Indigenous-led efforts to address historical and ongoing racism, oppression, and marginalization, both in Canadian society and elsewhere, while at the same time honoring their resilience and resistance to this oppression. So I am very grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land. And I ask you similarly to take some time to think about the land that you are on. So everybody here, I'm pretty sure, is pretty familiar with IPV and IPV related brain injury, but I'll provide a brief overview just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So by intimate partner violence, we're talking about behavior by an intimate partner or ex-partner that has caused some kind of harm, including physical, sexual, or psychological. And it includes aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and other controlling behaviors. And recent estimates suggest that 1 in 3 women globally will experience IPV at some point in their lifetime. Now, the most common injuries of physical forms of intimate partner violence are to the head, face, or neck, including strangulation, which results in brain injury in up to 75% of survivors. This is associated with higher levels of depression, anxiety, PTSD, and poor overall physical health. Now, one of the concerns is that IPV can lead to a situation where there are repetitive injuries. And as we know from other fields of concussion and TBI, the repetitive injuries can lead to compounding and exponentially problematic issues, which is particularly concerning in this situation of IPV. And again, in this context, seeking care is not very frequent. So less than 25% are estimated to seek care at the time of their injury, which means that many of these injuries go undiagnosed and unrecognized. Now, before jumping into, we're talking about system level changes and how we need to approach this, I just want to give you a little bit of a numbers game here. So if we stop for a second and think that the prevalence of IPV related brain injury among survivors is between 19 and 75%. If we're going with a conservative middle of the road estimate, that's 50% of, our old numbers were 1 in 4. That's, 1 in 8 women will experience IPV related brain injury in their life, which is equivalent to the breast cancer statistics in Canada. So if we think about the resources, the visibility, the lack of stigma that's surrounding breast cancer now, all of the work that's gone into breast cancer, and a similar equivalency of number of women are experiencing IPV related brain injury, and yet it's much under recognized and under researched. So we've got lots of work to do, which is where hopefully our system level changes findings from this summit come in. So I've got our funders across the top here, which this work would not have been possible without them. And the QR code in the corner will take you to the published article if you want to read more. But today I'll be presenting kind of the highlights from our paper from the special issue that was the intersection of intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury, findings from an emergency summit addressing system level changes to better support women survivors. Now, we used a community-based participatory research approach to this work, engaging 30 stakeholders from a national IPV TBI knowledge to practice, or K2P network, that includes women survivors, service providers, researchers, and decision makers from across Canada, in a virtual summit that consisted of 2 4-hour meetings. Most of these individuals were focused in IPV, TBI, or healthcare sectors, or some combination of the 3. We conducted small breakout group sessions to engage stakeholders in conversations around a number of things, including COVID, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. But here we're really focusing on the kind of system level changes that we really see needing to take place in Canada, but applicable more broadly as well. Those sessions were audio recorded and transcribed. We also had live note taking going on during those sessions so that individuals could see in real time what was being captured from the discussion and provide feedback on that, as well as to facilitate group report backs at the end of each session. And then all of that was thematically analyzed and then checked with all of the participants. I want to take a second just to give you a kind of an overview of who was in the room. So the majority of individuals were involved in either TBI or IPV direct service or advocacy and support. A lot of those individuals also had other hats that they wore. So many of our healthcare providers, for example, considered themselves to be involved in TBI or IPV direct service, but were also healthcare practitioners. And you can see that they had worked in the sector for almost 20 years on average. And there were a variety of different foci for the organizations that they were representing. Now, the participants themselves were predominantly women, but we do have a good diversity of identity, including Black and Indigenous and non-Black or non-Indigenous people of color, as well as individuals who identified as immigrants with disabilities or from the LGBTQ2S community. So, as I'm sure many of you can appreciate, we had 2 days worth of conversations that were incredible, and it's very difficult to both pull out the important things for a paper and even more difficult to pull out the important things for a short talk like this. But we really came down to 3 main themes about the system level needs that we have that need to be kind of our next steps in terms of addressing them. So the first being that we really need trauma-informed, anti-racist, and equitable health and social care systems. This is true in Canada. I'm sure it's true more broadly across countries around the world, particularly in the climates of the last couple of years. We're seeing that come through more and more. We need cross-pollination of knowledge across disciplines. We heard a lot about silos and how individuals are working within their little bubbles, and we need to be connecting those bubbles and connecting people to the information relevant across those bubbles. And then finally, we need, stemming off of that cross-pollination of knowledge, to actually build system level support for integrating and coordinating those care systems. So I'm going to talk about each of these briefly in turn, and share some of the quotes from the participants. So, trauma-informed, anti-racist, and equitable care systems. This was something that, in reading through being part of these conversations and reading through the transcripts afterwards, just kind of hit you over the head, for a horrible, horrible analogy. But I want to share 3 really powerful quotes that really highlighted how important this is for people finding care and finding the care that they need. So, one stakeholder shared that one of the key things that we found within Black youth engagement was an inability to have Black health professionals. If their injury or the aspect of the gender-based violence that they're experiencing is in regards to race, often that is dismissed. Past experiences with racism within the healthcare system often prevents Black women from ever wanting to return. So if we think about all of the challenges that women survivors of IPV who have experienced a brain injury face, just at baseline in terms of accessing healthcare, when you add in that layered identity, that makes it all the more challenging. And there's all sorts of additional barriers in terms of accessing care. Now, again, this is now a critically important consideration. the intersectionality of race and gender, and how this, I have to say it, how colonial Canada is complicit in so many ways around creating a set of social circumstances, the history of Canada and its impact, particularly on gender violence that Indigenous women experience. We heard stakeholders share that Indigenous women who were seeking help having sustained a brain injury were assumed to be drunk and dismissed because the symptoms of their brain injury were presenting in such a way that was assumed to be intoxication. We need to change the way that our care systems are designed and are conducted so that that doesn't happen, right? We need to make sure that we're identifying this intersection of brain injury and intimate partner violence and providing the care without making assumptions about other things that might be happening in an individual's life or assuming that there's certain things going on. And something that I'll leave you with on this particular theme was that these microaggressions and overt racism can really impact what access individuals have to services. So, and a stakeholder shared, with all of that prejudgment and prejudice and discrimination and microaggressions that happen, how something then gets documented and qualifies somebody's services can be completely skewed based on that reaction or judgment. So if the right thing doesn't go into a file, then that door, that magical door to the next step of care doesn't open. And it's really critical that we don't let our own biases and racism, overt or covert, to impact the care that people have access to. So next, we're talking about cross-pollination of knowledge across disciplines. This is one that I personally find is one of my favorites because it seems to make so much sense, and yet we're not doing it. So talking to, particularly in the IPV TBI world, you've got IPV folks who are wonderful and focus on IPV. You've got TBI folks who are wonderful and focus on TBI. And in magical situations, you've got the IPV folks and the TBI folks in the same spot or talking to each other, or they happen to be the same people. And that is really where we end up seeing these magical pockets of care where survivors are really getting what they need. So you really need to understand the context a survivor shared, a stakeholder shared, the dynamic of the violence to understand why and how. So for me, I really see the need to put IPV and TBI together automatically when it comes to training people to understand that it's not a separate situation. It's a combined situation and we have to work through it. So we're not looking at the pieces, we're looking at the combined whole, and that's really important. And then an interesting to that piece about those IPV and TBI pieces so often being separate, it can lead to people being missed, right? So I thought this was particularly poignant. Something was shared, a service provider who typically would work in IPV kind of settings, but was working with a brain injury association. And they shared, if I wasn't working with a brain injury association, I would be solely focused on the trauma piece. You don't have to know everything about this, but let's just make sure that every door is the right door. And this leads us really well into our final theme, which is this systems level support for integrated and coordinated care. And this is, in Canada, going to be incredibly challenging because of the way our health system is designed. I can't speak to the situation in the States because I'm less familiar with your healthcare system, but I anticipate it being similarly complicated. And maybe Rachel can speak to this later. But right now we've got our silos, right? We've got this path for TBI, we've got this path for IPV. And in between those silos, we have what is often called gaps in services, right? So we've got a little bit of a space where there isn't anything. And in talking about that, one of our stakeholders shared that it's not really gaps that we're talking about. We're talking about massive, massive spaces. We're dealing with chasms. So they shared, let's stop saying gaps in services. We're dealing with massive chasms. They're swallowing people whole, and we expect them to just kind of be able to step over the gap and keep on their recovery journey. These are not gaps. We're not calling things what they are. And so what we're doing is basically rescuing people from these massive chasms that you fall into as an injured person, as someone who has a history and experience of trauma. And if you don't have somebody to help you navigate between those chasms, around those chasms, over those chasms, then you don't get the care that you need. And we need something systemic in place so that we remove those chasms, but also create a system of navigation so that any chasms that still exist can be navigated appropriately to get the care that you need. I think this goes back to this quote goes back to our talk about, or the quote about, let every door be the right door. Particularly with IPV and IPV related TBI, we don't know where people are going to find their touch point, right? So, and in talking about that, a survivor or a stakeholder shared that we really need to cast a pretty wide web. So there's no standard pathway for one person through any aspect of our healthcare system, which is very true, and also into our healthcare system, also very different. That's my side point adding in. So we never know who that touch point is going to be. And maybe someone will only ever seek one resource, whether it be their librarian or their pastor or a shelter. And it has to be a sort of all hands on deck to make sure that no matter where that touch point is within the system, those touch points have the information to get the proper supports to these individuals. So that's, again, this building bridges between the silos and connecting people in so we have a broader awareness so that someone can identify somebody in this situation and say, hey, this is where we go from here. And so that we don't end up with people falling into those chasms and getting stuck there. And the final thing that I won't read through this entire quote, but it just highlights the fact that we have coordinated care processes for so many things, right? So stroke, cancer care, we're working on concussion care in sports-related concussions in Canada. So there's lots of public health issues that have kind of a trajectory that you go through. And we need to be working towards something that does something similar for IPV-related TBI. Because we know that brain injury, from the brain injury side of things, we know that it's an interdisciplinary and a multidisciplinary team approach, right? So there's complex needs that need to be addressed by complex care, coordinated care. And being able to do that and tie in trauma-informed care, again, to our first piece, to make sure that survivors are safe and cared for, is really important. Okay, and since we talked about COVID at the beginning, I am not going to go into this in very much detail, but just leave you with two little tidbits before I round out. We know that IPV has been exacerbated through COVID. So both the number and severity of reports of IPV have increased over the last almost 2 years now. And Canadian estimates are up to 30%, but there's still not a lot of data on the intersection of IPV and TBI in this particular context. So we have two recent papers that came out that start to address this knowledge gap that I won't talk about in depth here, but I'll share them with you so that you can go and find them if you're interested. So this is the study that came out of the same summit that I was talking about for the duration of the talk, focusing on the COVID-19 related impacts. Again, there's the QR code in the corner if you're interested. It's currently in press, so you get to see my lovely Word document on that website. And then, of course, Lynn's wonderful paper that was published in a special issue. Again, that QR code is there, that shared a lot about provider perspectives as well on the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts that it has had on them in their provision of care. And if you're interested and don't feel like reading, we did a talk for the Can COVID speaker series in the fall sometime, maybe in November. The YouTube link is there and you can see us give an overview of those two papers and their findings there as well. Before I round out, I want to acknowledge the IPV TBI consortium. So these are the stakeholders who were part of that summit. They are incredible individuals doing incredible work and working for incredible organizations. And really none of this work would have been possible without them. And finally, I want to thank all of our funders for the various things that we do at the ABI Lab, and thank the ABI Lab for all of their support. And well, yeah, all their support for everything, really. Hard to summarize that when you're doing a PhD. And that's, I'll leave it there. If there's any questions. I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat. I apologize.
Yes, would anyone like to ask any questions? A great presentation. Thank you so much. And thank you for jumping in with very little notice. Any questions out
You're
there
welcome.
from the group?
I just want to thank you so much for that presentation, Danielle. I just want to recognize Michelle Bartlett, who was one of our members who was very passionate about this topic, who actually passed away before the paper came out, and we've dedicated the paper to her. She did a lot for Brain Injury Canada on this topic, and she was so passionate about the topic of preventing and addressing IPV among women with brain injuries based on her experience and also of others.
Yeah, thank you. And Danielle, do you want to talk anything about what you're next planning to work on?
Oh, there's a laundry list. So I mean, the work from my thesis is focusing on access to care with mental health and substance use. So we know that there's often challenges in identifying brain injury, in part because some of the impacts of brain injury can look so similar to mental health concerns. So exploring that a little bit, and survivors' experiences and service providers' experiences with that weird kind of, I shouldn't say weird, that interesting and integrated dynamic. Yeah, and we've got a lot of things up our sleeve, Angela. I don't know.
It's never ending, never
like
ending
too
since I
many
met
things
you
to do.
all. Well,
Yeah,
thank you for sharing that, and we'll let you know whether the February meeting will or we'll skip to March. I know some people have some conflict with the next one. I did want to put in the chat. Well, actually, first, I just want to just share my screen for a second and show you on the Pink Concussions website. There's the section DV Task Force. If you click that, there is a page to join the task force. And that's if you came on today and you aren't part of the task force. We also have the videos to the last 2 years of phone calls, and most of them have a video link, the guest speaker's deck, and notes that our wonderful PhD candidate should be a PhD by now. Hope Kent at Exeter does. And then we had, and so those materials are for 2 years. We also have a list of, I actually tracked COVID from China across the world over the first 2 months of COVID. And we have, other press, I don't know, it was under there, other press articles, and then other sites that we recommend, which is Rachel's Center in Ohio. We have the Abused and Brain Injured Toolkit, and then we have the Concussion Awareness Toolkit. And if you have other organizations that just got that back up, if you have other organizations you'd like us to add to that resource list. And also, Teen Concussions is continuing. This is our second year of looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've reached out. We might even do like a couple-hour retreat with an advisor, if that. And we're looking at if your organization has a DEI statement. We'd love to look at those, and we're trying to, it's really important to us, in the next month or so to finally bring that as a living document up there to discuss the issues that Danielle spoke about. And I think that the racism and the barriers to access for women of color, men of color, children of color are so important to speak about and call out, especially as a white woman of privilege, to use these platforms that we have to really keep pushing at this issue. And that, these issues are so important It's really going to take all of us together. But again, I think there's so much synergy happening right now. And lastly, if you are in another part of the world, we're also putting together infographic of what different parts of the world use for the term domestic violence or IPV. There are places like CDC where they use the words interchangeably. I believe from this group that if you use IPV, it's somebody that is a partner in a way that as a sexual relationship. Dan, you put your definition up there. I know Australia uses family violence. So we're just trying to put sort of together a graph of different words used around the world for this and how it's discussed in other countries. So if you're from, I know there are 9 different countries on this call. If that's part, just, reach out and share with us. Angela, Eve, Rachel, any other things you'd like to say before we close down?
I'm just I just texted put them in the chat. Thanks everybody for coming. It's awesome to see everybody. And thank you so much for showing up for these calls. We're together, going to make a difference. I know it. And it gives me optimism, which isn't always easy to have in this field. So thank you so much, everybody.
I want to thank Katherine, as usual, for all her
Yes.
leadership and all her
Absolutely.
Well, it's
100%.
all the media and all the, all the plugs, so.
I've got really smart interns that I used to be cool, but I opened up and I'm trying to learn. And we did put our first TikTok out there thanks to the interns. So, and you think just the social media that's available, the free resources to get information out. And I can't remember I think it was that if you did that on TikTok, that meant that you were in a situation where you needed help. I think it was something like this, but I think that especially those of us in the older crowd, we really have to be open to how a new generation is using social media and how a new generation is using this. I'll be also asking for your Twitter handles or your organizations so that when we put posts out, we can, connect you so it comes through your Twitter feed. And again, you don't really have to tweet to have a Twitter feed. So love to thank, and anyone out there that works in media that wants to help out too, that would be great. Thank you, Stacy. So thank you all. And I'm on day 15 of COVID and still tired. And I know a lot of people out there are still kind of straggling through. I did see a return to protocol for exercise at COVID that said you really should wait 7 days without a symptom before going back to the gym. And that was in a Women's Health magazine. So, that's something I think that's sort of important to get out there. So if you're in that COVID crowd, please take care. And there's plenty of work to do. Rest up. And we'll see you this Thursday is Casual Conversations, and Tamara Wexler is going to be on when talking a second. We're going to go down deep with some endocrine disorder after TBI, and we'll see you later. So thank you, everybody. Take care.